The Zyrenian slave market was a dark and dangerous place, hidden deep on a lawless planet where the only law was power. For Sari, a young Zyrenian girl with shimmering green skin, the market was the place where her life had been sold to the highest bidder. She had been captured during a raid on her village, torn from her family, and brought here like a piece of merchandise. Her small hands shook in fear as she stood with other slaves, their eyes downcast, afraid to meet the gaze of the bidders who inspected them like animals. Sari wasn't even sure how long she had been here. Days? Weeks? It didn't matter. Time lost meaning when you were nothing but property. Sari was different from the others. While most of the slaves were adults, warriors, or workers, she was just a child, too small and too weak to survive in this cruel world alone. The other slaves avoided looking at her, too afraid to care, but Sari clung to a small hope. Someone might save her. But with each passing day, that hope felt smaller and smaller. The auctioneer's loud voice echoed through the market as he raised his hand, signaling the beginning of the next sale. The lights flickered above, casting shadows over the crowd. They were here for the slaves, but Sari's heart beat only for freedom. It felt impossible, but she imagined escaping, running far away from this place. Then it happened. A deep, commanding voice cut through the noise. "I'll pay double. Let the girl go." Sari froze, her heart skipping a beat. She didn't understand. The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, like a promise. The crowd went silent. She slowly lifted her head, her wide, alien eyes searching for the source of that voice. A man stood in the back of the crowd. He was tall, his figure strong, but his face was covered by a hood. Even from a distance, Sari could feel something different about him. Strength and kindness mixed together. His eyes were dark, but there was no cruelty in them. The auctioneer hesitated, glancing at the man. "Double?" he asked, looking confused. The man's answer was simple. "Yes." Without another word, he tossed a pile of credits onto the table. The auctioneer stared at the money, but it was clear there was no argument to be made. "Take her." The auctioneer waved his hand dismissively, and just like that, Sari was free. Her heart raced as the man approached her, his hand outstretched. Sari took a step back, uncertain and scared, but the man knelt in front of her, his eyes soft, and he spoke again. "You're safe now," he said, his voice gentle. "I'm not going to hurt you." Sari didn't trust him, not yet, but something in his voice made her hesitate. For the first time since being captured, she felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this human could be the one to finally break her chains. Sari stood still, staring up at the human who had just bought her freedom. His hand remained outstretched, but she didn't move. She was still too scared to trust him completely. The feeling of being bought and sold, like a thing with no choice, was too fresh in her mind. But there was something in his eyes, something that told her he was different. The man seemed to notice her hesitation. He smiled softly and lowered his hand, as if to show he didn't want to scare her. "My name is Daniel," he said gently, his voice calm and steady. "I'm not going to hurt you." Sari could barely understand his words, but something about his tone made her feel less afraid. He wasn't like the others. His voice didn't carry the weight of power or cruelty. There was something kind in it. She slowly took a step toward him, unsure of what to do, but feeling strangely safe in his presence. Daniel stood up and motioned toward the door of the market. "Come with me," he said. "We need to get out of here." Sari glanced around, still uncertain. She had spent so long surrounded by the cruelty of this place that leaving it felt wrong. She had been treated as less than a person, and it was hard to imagine a life outside the slave market. But the look in Daniel's eyes told her he was serious. Maybe, just maybe, this was her chance to escape. For the first time in a long time, Sari felt hope stirring inside her. She followed Daniel, her small feet moving quietly behind his larger steps. As they walked out into the bright sunlight, she squinted against the unfamiliar light, the warmth of the sun hitting her skin. It was a strange feeling, like a small piece of normalcy returning to her world. Daniel led her to a small, beaten-up ship parked near the market. It wasn't anything special, but it was clean and well-maintained. It looked like it had seen many miles, but still had life in it. He opened the door and gestured for Sari to go inside. "This is my ship," Daniel explained as she hesitated. "It's not much, but it's home. You'll be safe here." Sari stepped inside, still unsure. The inside of the ship was cramped but cozy. There was a small bunk bed, a table, and a few control panels blinking softly. It wasn't anything fancy, but it felt different. It felt like a place where she could finally rest without fear. Daniel moved to the front of the ship and began adjusting some controls. "We'll be heading to a safe place," he said, not looking back at her. "But it'll take a while. For now, you can rest." Sari didn't know what to say. The words in her head didn't come out. She wanted to ask him why he had done this, why he had bought her, why he cared. But she didn't know how to voice those questions. Daniel glanced over his shoulder and gave her a reassuring smile. "I'm not asking for anything in return," he said. "I just couldn't stand to see you treated like that. No one deserves to live like that." Sari nodded, unsure if she believed him. But there was something in his voice, something she had never heard from anyone else. For the first time, she felt not alone. Sari sat down on the small bunk, her legs shaking as the ship hummed to life. Outside, the stars began to blink into existence as they left the slave market far behind. She was free. But for how long? The thought still lingered in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that danger was never far behind. The stars drifted by the window of the ship as it sailed silently through the galaxy. For Sari, the hum of the engines was a strange comfort. It was the first time in what felt like forever that she could sleep without the fear of waking up in chains. But even though she was safe for the moment, she couldn't forget. The memories of the market, the auctioneer's cruel voice, and the other slaves haunted her thoughts. Daniel had been kind, but nothing was certain in the galaxy. Trust didn't come easily, especially after all that had happened to her. The ship was small, but Daniel made sure she was comfortable. He even gave her a small room at the back of the ship to rest. Still, as the hours passed, Sari found herself staring out the window, watching the distant stars blink in the void. She was free, but freedom felt different. It felt fragile, like something that could be taken away at any moment. Then, her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of an alarm blaring from the ship's control room. Sari jumped to her feet, panic rising in her chest. What was happening? She rushed toward the front of the ship, her heart racing. Daniel was already sitting in the pilot's seat, his eyes scanning the ship's controls. He looked calm, but there was a tension in the air that made Sari nervous. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "We've been spotted," Daniel said, his eyes still glued to the screens. "Someone's tracking us." Sari's stomach dropped. She knew who it was. The Zyrenian Syndicate. They would never let a slave escape so easily. Her heart pounded in her chest as she thought of the hunters they had sent after her, those cruel men and women who would do anything to bring her back. Daniel's voice broke through her panic. "We need to outrun them. Hold on tight." Before Sari could respond, the ship jolted, and the stars outside the window became streaks of light. Daniel had put the ship into full speed, sending it shooting toward the nearest asteroid field. The ship shook and rattled as they darted between massive rocks, the sound of the engines roaring in the distance. Sari held on to the nearest seat, her knuckles white. Her heart raced with fear, but she forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't afford to panic. "Do you think they'll catch us?" she asked, her voice quiet but filled with worry. "They won't," Daniel said firmly, though his eyes flickered with concern. "I've dealt with worse, but they'll keep trying. We need to be smart about this." The ship weaved between the jagged rocks, avoiding the larger asteroid clusters with expert precision. Sari watched through the window, her eyes wide with wonder and fear. She had never been in a situation like this before. Every second felt like a lifetime. Just then, a new alarm blared. This one was even louder, and it made the hairs on the back of Sari's neck stand up. "Incoming," Daniel shouted, his voice filled with urgency. Sari turned around in time to see the pursuing ship, a sleek, black vessel, closing in fast. She could make out the sharp shape of the ship, its engines glowing red as it shot through space after them. The Syndicate was closing in, and there was no way they could outrun them for long. "Hold on," Daniel yelled again, pushing the throttle even harder. The asteroid field grew denser, the rocks moving faster around them, as the two ships entered the maze of jagged stones. Sari could see the enemy ship now, right behind them, chasing them through the debris. The chase was on, and there was no way to escape unless they could lose them in the field. Sari's heart pounded as the two ships raced through space. This was only the beginning. The chase through the asteroid field was wild, the ship's engines screaming as it weaved through sharp rocks. Sari's stomach twisted with every sudden turn. Every moment the ship seemed like it would crash into one of the massive asteroids. But Daniel didn't flinch. His eyes were focused, his hands steady on the controls. "Stay down," Daniel said, his voice calm but urgent. "We'll need to do more than outrun them." Sari crouched low in the seat, gripping the armrests tightly, her mind racing. She had never seen anything like this before. She didn't know much about space battles, but she could feel the tension in the air. They were being hunted, and it wasn't just for the price on her head. It was about control, power. The Syndicate didn't care about anything except getting back what was theirs. And to them, Sari was just a possession. The enemy ship's engines roared behind them, much closer now. It was sleek and black, built for speed and intimidation. It was the type of ship that would rip through anything in its path. Sari could see the outline of the bounty hunters on board, their faces cold and focused, prepared for the kill. "Are you a soldier?" Sari asked, her voice trembling slightly. Daniel glanced back at her, his expression hardening. "I used to be," he said simply, his gaze quickly returning to the screen in front of him. "You'll understand soon enough." Sari didn't fully understand what he meant, but she was beginning to see it. The way he moved, the way he spoke, the confidence he carried. He wasn't just a mercenary. He was someone who had fought, someone who had seen war, and war never left you. Suddenly, the enemy ship fired. A blast of red light shot toward them, shaking the ship violently. The warning lights blinked on, and the control panel screamed in alarm. "We've got a hit," Daniel cursed under his breath. "The shields are holding, but we need to get out of here. Get ready." Sari's heart raced, but she didn't have time to be scared. The ship lurched again as Daniel fired back, hitting the enemy ship with a blast of his own. The return fire was fierce, and Sari felt a jolt go through her body as the ship swerved sharply to avoid another shot. "Keep your head down," Daniel shouted. "We're not done yet." Sari ducked, trying to follow his instructions. Her mind was still spinning with fear, but now there was something else building inside her. Adrenaline. She had never felt this kind of energy before, the kind of urgency that came with being in the middle of a fight. She had been a slave, a victim, for so long. But now, as she clutched the seat and felt the ship dodge another blast, she knew something had shifted. Daniel turned to her quickly. "If you want to survive, you need to learn how to fight. And that means learning how to think." Sari nodded quickly, her hands trembling as she gripped the seat. She wanted to ask him what he meant, but another shot hit the ship, throwing them both forward. She caught herself on the edge of the control panel and looked back at Daniel. His face was set, determined, but there was something else in his eyes. He was teaching her. "Start learning," he said with urgency. "The next time they fire, we fire back." It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about fighting. Fighting for control. Fighting for freedom. The enemy ship was closing in. Sari could feel her heart beating faster with each passing second. The battle was no longer a distant threat. It was here. The syndicate bounty hunters had finally caught up, and there was nowhere to run. Daniel's eyes were sharp, his fingers moving quickly over the controls. He didn't look panicked, but Sari could see the focus in his face. Every move mattered now. "Hold tight," he said quietly, as he spun the ship sharply to the left, dodging another blast from the black ship that had been chasing them for hours. The force of the turn sent Sari's stomach into her throat, but she didn't complain. She had to trust Daniel. The ship's shields crackled with another hit. "Shields are weakening," Daniel muttered. "If they keep this up, we won't be able to escape much longer." Sari's eyes flicked to the control panel, where warning lights were flashing red. They were running out of time. She could feel it in the air. This wasn't just a chase anymore. It was a fight for their lives. The enemy ship didn't let up. They were relentless. Another blast hit, and this time the ship jolted hard enough to throw Sari against the wall. She gasped for breath, but Daniel didn't hesitate. He immediately corrected the ship's course and aimed the weapons at their pursuers. It was clear now. This wouldn't end until one of them was destroyed. A voice crackled over the comms, sending a chill down Sari's spine. "This is Kane." Sari's blood ran cold. She had heard stories about Varric Kane, the bounty hunter who was feared across the galaxy. He was the Syndicate's best, a merciless killer who didn't stop until his target was dead. And now he was after them. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Kane," he muttered under his breath. "Of course it's him." "Who's Kane?" Sari asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The best." Daniel's eyes never left the control panel as he adjusted the ship's speed, trying to stay ahead of Kane's ship. "He's a professional killer. No one escapes him." The voice came again, this time with a deadly calmness. "You think you can outrun me, human? I'll find you, no matter where you go. And when I do, I will end you." Sari swallowed hard. The coldness in Kane's voice sent a shiver through her body. Daniel's face hardened, but his hands moved quickly, his focus sharper than ever. "I've dealt with him before," Daniel said, almost to himself. "But it's different this time. We got a kid with us now." Sari felt the weight of his words. She wasn't just a helpless passenger anymore. She was part of the reason they were being hunted, part of the reason Daniel was in danger. "I'll help," she said suddenly, surprising herself. Daniel glanced at her, his eyes softening for a moment. "Not yet. You're not ready." Sari's jaw set in determination. She wasn't going to be a burden. She had been weak for too long. She wouldn't let that happen again. The enemy ship fired again, a powerful blast that sent their ship tumbling into a roll. Sari held on, but she knew something had to change. "We need to fight back," she said, more firmly this time. Daniel looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like he was considering her words. Then, with a sharp nod, he turned back to the controls. "All right," he said. "You're ready for this." He didn't waste another second. The fight was on. The ship shuddered as another blast from Kane's ship tore through the vacuum of space. The shields flickered, barely holding, while the control panel screamed warnings. Sari's grip on the seat tightened, her heart pounding in her chest. It was clear now. This wasn't just a chase anymore. Kane was hunting them down with one goal: to kill them both. "We need a plan." Daniel's voice was steady, though the lines on his face were hardening. His hands flew over the controls, trying to adjust their course and keep the ship from breaking apart. Sari didn't want to just sit back and watch. She had been a slave. She had been helpless for so long, but now she could feel a fire in her chest. She wasn't going to run away anymore. "I want to help," she said again, louder this time. Daniel's gaze flickered to her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. "All right. Stay focused. This is what you've been waiting for." He moved to the weapons console and handed her a small handheld control pad. "This is the targeting system. You see the red dots on the screen. Those are Kane's ship's weak points. I'm going to need you to lock onto them when I give the signal. Sari's fingers shook as she held the device, but she steadied herself. She looked at the screen in front of her, where the red dots blinked ominously. She could do this. Daniel adjusted the ship's speed again, making a sharp turn to the left as Kane's ship fired another round. This time, they were ready. Now, Daniel shouted. Sari's fingers flew across the buttons. She focused hard, the red dots blurring together for a second. Then she locked onto one of the weaker points of Kane's ship. The ship fired. A burst of energy shot from their ship, hitting Kane's vessel squarely on the rear engine. For a brief moment, Sari felt a rush of victory, but the enemy ship didn't slow down. If anything, Kane's ship seemed more determined than before. He's not going down that easily, Daniel said under his breath, his eyes never leaving the controls. We've just made him angry. Sari swallowed, but she wasn't backing down now. She had to stay focused. The red dots blinked again on the screen, signaling the next weak point on Kane's ship. Her fingers hovered over the controls. This was her chance to do more. Lock on, Daniel yelled. This time, Sari was ready. Her finger pressed down hard on the trigger. The blast hit Kane's ship, but it only damaged the outer hull. The bounty hunter wasn't done yet. They'll keep coming, Daniel warned. We need to outsmart them, not just outfight them. Sari glanced at him, the words sinking in. She wasn't just a soldier in this fight. She needed to think like one. Daniel had been teaching her about survival, about thinking ahead, but she was starting to realize how much she had to learn. What now? Sari asked, her voice steady. Daniel's eyes met hers, a flash of respect in them. Now we use the asteroid field again. We lead them into the heart of it and make them chase us. When we lose them, we take the shot. Sari nodded, her hand steady now. The battle wasn't just about surviving. It was about outsmarting Kane. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was learning to fight back. Daniel turned the ship hard again, plunging straight for the dense asteroid field. Rocks flashed past them at high speed, the sharp edges narrowly missing their ship. Behind them, Kane's ship followed, faster and more determined than ever. But this time, they were the hunters. The asteroid field was like a maze of sharp rocks, spinning and tumbling in the emptiness of space. Daniel's hands were steady on the controls as the ship darted between the massive chunks of debris, narrowly avoiding collisions. Sari sat behind him, watching the pursuit unfold through the small window at the front of the ship. She could see Kane's ship, relentless and unyielding, following them through the chaos. The bounty hunter was too good, and no matter how fast Daniel flew, Kane wasn't slowing down. We have to lose him, Daniel said, his voice low but tense. He gritted his teeth as the ship lurched with another sharp turn. This can't go on forever. Sari nodded. She could feel the sweat on her palms, the nervousness building up inside her. She wasn't used to this, being on the run, fighting for survival. But she had already come so far. She couldn't go back. We have to use the environment, Daniel continued. The asteroid field is our advantage. But we need to lead him into the dead center, where there's no way out. Sari's eyes scanned the field. The rocks were huge, some bigger than the ship itself. They had to fly through the field in a way that would make Kane's ship unable to follow them. What do you need me to do? Sari asked, her voice steady despite the rising tension. She was ready. She had to be. Keep an eye on the sensors, Daniel said, his tone focused. Tell me if Kane starts to pull ahead or if he's lining up for another attack. Sari nodded and immediately began watching the small, blinking lights on the console beside her. The sensors were picking up every movement of Kane's ship, every shift in trajectory. She watched the readouts carefully. Kane was staying close, waiting for his chance to strike. Sari's hand gripped the edge of her seat as the ship veered sharply to the right. Her eyes darted to the readings. Kane was adjusting his speed. He was planning something. He's getting ready to fire again, she said, her voice sharp with warning. He's locking on. Daniel didn't hesitate. Without a word, he yanked the control lever and spun the ship to the left, forcing Kane's targeting system to miss. The ship rocked as another blast passed too close, but they had narrowly avoided it. Sari's breath caught in her throat. That was close. Too close, Daniel muttered. We're not going to survive another round like that. We need to make him think we're heading into a dead end. Daniel made a sudden, dramatic turn, leading the ship directly toward the heart of the asteroid field. The rocks here were much larger, almost forming a barrier that would trap anyone who ventured too deep. I'm going to make him follow us. When he gets too close to the rocks, we turn and make the shot. Sari felt a cold chill run down her spine. This was it. If they could pull this off, they'd finally lose Kane. But if they didn't, there was no other way out. Ready, Sari said, her voice tight with determination. As they reached the center of the field, Daniel began to slow the ship just slightly. Kane's ship, always so close, adjusted its course, trying to match their movements. It was all or nothing now. Sari's heart pounded in her chest as the targeting system locked onto Kane's ship. She held her breath and waited for Daniel's command. Now, Sari, fire, Daniel shouted. Without thinking, Sari pressed the button. A powerful burst of energy shot from their ship, hitting Kane's vessel squarely on the engines. There was a flash of light, and the enemy ship's speed immediately slowed. A low groan of metal echoed through their own ship as they felt the shockwave from the explosion. Kane's ship was severely damaged. Sari couldn't believe it. They had done it. For the first time, they had outsmarted the hunter. But before she could even celebrate, a new message crackled over the comms. This isn't over. Kane's voice was cold, dangerous. I'll be back for you. The communication cut off, and Sari sat back in her seat, her heart still racing. They had won this round, but the war was far from over. We need to move fast, Daniel said, quickly adjusting the controls. We've bought ourselves some time, but not much. Let's get out of here before he calls for backup. Sari nodded. She wasn't sure how much longer they could keep running, but for the first time, she felt a spark of hope. They weren't dead yet. The ship was now flying through the blackness of space, the asteroid field a distant memory behind them. Sari's hands were still trembling from the rush of their close call, but she didn't let it show. The battle with Kane had been intense, but they had survived. For now, Daniel was focused at the controls, his eyes scanning the ship's systems. The damage from the fight wasn't as bad as it could have been, but their ship wasn't in perfect condition either. The engines were working, but the shields were down, and the hull had a few new dents. We need to get to a safe place, Daniel muttered, more to himself than to Sari. Somewhere Kane won't be able to track us easily. Sari glanced over at him, trying to read his face. There was something about his expression that was different now, more serious. He wasn't just trying to survive. He was planning ahead, looking for a place where they could rest, regroup, and figure out what to do next. Where do we go? Sari asked, breaking the silence. We can't keep running forever. Daniel's eyes met hers. There was a moment of silence before he spoke again. There's a planet, out on the edge of the system. It's not well known, mostly forgotten. There's a small settlement there, a place where people lay low. We'll blend in, get some repairs, and make a new plan. Sari nodded. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than nothing. She could see how worn down Daniel was. He had been leading them through one dangerous situation after another without a break. They both needed time to rest. But even as the idea of rest sounded good, a part of Sari's mind couldn't stop thinking about the fight with Kane. What would happen when Kane came back with reinforcements? You think he'll just let us go? Sari asked, her voice quiet. No, Daniel said, his tone heavy. Kane will come back. He's persistent, and he won't stop until he gets what he wants. Sari's heart sank. She had been hoping they would get a break, but it seemed like the danger was far from over. Daniel was right. Kane wouldn't give up easily. I won't stop either, Sari said, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. I won't let him take me back. Daniel looked at her, his expression softening for a moment. I don't plan to let that happen, he said simply. For a brief moment, the weight of everything seemed to hang in the air. They were no longer running from the past. They were running towards something. Freedom. And in that moment, Sari realized something important. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was part of this fight. The ship glided silently through space, the stars blinking quietly around them. Sari leaned back in her seat, trying to steady her breathing. They were on the edge of the galaxy now, and every light in the dark space felt like a reminder of how far they had come and how far they still had to go. How long until we get there? Sari asked. A couple of hours, Daniel answered, his voice calm. Get some rest while you can. We'll need our strength for what's coming next. Sari nodded. She had already seen how hard Daniel worked to keep them alive, and she understood now that the fight wasn't over. They were just getting started. As she closed her eyes, her thoughts turned to the future. There was still so much unknown, but for the first time, Sari felt ready. They could take on whatever came next. The planet loomed ahead, a quiet world with soft blue skies and vast empty landscapes. It looked peaceful, almost serene, but Sari knew better. She had learned that nothing was ever truly safe in this galaxy, not anymore. They had come here hoping for a brief moment of peace, but the calm was only temporary. Daniel guided the ship down through the atmosphere, the planet's surface coming into view. The settlement he had mentioned was small, tucked away in a valley surrounded by mountains. It looked like an isolated place, and that was exactly what they needed, a place to hide. This is it, Daniel said, his voice steady. We'll land, get some supplies, and figure out our next move. Sari nodded, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in her chest. She hadn't been on a planet like this before, one that wasn't ruled by a powerful government or syndicate. Here, it seemed like people lived quietly, trying to stay out of trouble. The ship touched down with a soft thud, and the engines powered down. Silence filled the air as Sari unstrapped herself from her seat and stood up. She stretched her stiff muscles, feeling the effects of the long journey. They had barely had time to rest in between the battles. It was strange to finally be on solid ground again. Daniel was already at the controls, working quickly. Stay low. We don't want anyone knowing who we are, especially if there are bounty hunters around. Sari nodded, understanding. They had to be careful. Kane wasn't the only danger they had to worry about. There were always other eyes, other threats lurking in the shadows. The ship door slid open with a quiet hiss, revealing the dusty streets of the small settlement. It wasn't much, just a few buildings, some old merchant carts, and people moving about their daily lives. At first glance, it seemed like a normal town, but Sari could tell there was more to it than that. It felt like a place where secrets were kept. Daniel stepped out first, scanning the area before nodding for Sari to follow. As they moved toward the town, Sari couldn't help but feel the weight of their situation. They had to stay hidden. No one could know who they were. If word got out that a fugitive was in the settlement, it would only be a matter of time before trouble found them. Let's get to the market, Daniel said, leading the way. We'll find supplies, and maybe even someone who can help us with repairs. The market was a mix of old and new technology, parts of ships, food supplies, and basic survival gear. Sari felt out of place among the people haggling and trading. Most of them didn't seem like they cared about who was buying or selling. They were just trying to survive, like everyone else. Daniel stopped at a stall, where a gruff man with a thick beard looked up from his work. Need anything? He asked gruffly. We need supplies, Daniel said. And maybe some ship repairs. We're just passing through. The man nodded and pointed to the back of the stall. I got what you need. And if you want your ship fixed, I know a guy. But don't go making a scene. Got it? Daniel handed over a few credits, and the man quickly packed a bag with what they needed. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. Sari could see that Daniel was already thinking ahead, planning their next move. They couldn't stay here forever. Kane would eventually find them, and when he did, they would need to be ready. As they left the stall and made their way back to the ship, Suri couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, but there was nothing unusual, just people going about their business. Still, something about the way the town felt made her uneasy. "Let's move quickly," Daniel said, sensing her tension. "We don't have much time." As they returned to the ship, Suri took one last look at the settlement. She had no idea what was waiting for them next, but she knew this. They couldn't keep running forever. One day, they would have to face Kane again. And when that day came, they had to be ready. The days in the small settlement passed in a blur of careful movements and quiet plans. Daniel and Suri kept their heads down, blending in with the locals. The repairs to their ship were nearly finished, but both of them knew the truth. Kane would come for them. It was only a matter of time before the bounty hunter found their trail. Suri spent most of her time in the quiet corners of the settlement, watching the people, learning their ways. She had never felt this kind of peace before, but it was fragile. The quiet streets, the simple lives of the settlers, were not a safe place to hide forever. Daniel, as always, was focused on the ship. He spent hours in the workshop, checking the systems, making sure the ship was ready for the inevitable chase. He was always thinking ahead, always preparing for the worst. One evening, as the sun set over the planet, casting an orange glow over the dusty ground, Daniel turned to Suri with a serious expression. "It's time," he said. "We can't stay here any longer. We need to leave before Kane finds us." Suri looked at him, her heart racing. She had known this moment would come, but it was still hard to accept. She had gotten used to the quiet, used to the feeling of being safe. But safety was a lie. They had never truly been safe. "Where are we going?" Suri asked, her voice steady despite the tension she felt. "Where can we go that he won't find us?" Daniel paused, looking out toward the horizon. "There's a hidden system, far out in the outer rim. It's off the maps. I know someone there. They can help us, but we have to move fast." Suri nodded, trusting him. She had seen how much Daniel had sacrificed to keep them alive, and she knew he wasn't the kind of man who would lead her into danger without a good reason. The night was quiet as they prepared to leave. The ship was fueled and ready, the repairs complete. The only thing left was to take off and disappear into the vastness of space before Kane could catch up. As they lifted off from the settlement, Suri looked back one last time. The small town, so peaceful, was quickly shrinking behind them, but a part of her knew it would be the last time she would ever see it. Kane was out there, and he would never stop hunting them. The ship ascended into the night sky, the stars stretching out before them. Suri sat beside Daniel, her hands clenched tightly on her lap. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was it. They were running again, but this time, they weren't just surviving. They were fighting for their future. Suddenly, the comm system crackled to life. It was a message, and Suri's heart skipped a beat when she heard the voice. "You can't run forever." It was Kane's voice. Cold, determined. Daniel's face hardened. "I knew it," he muttered. "He's tracking us." Suri stood up quickly. "What do we do?" Daniel didn't hesitate. His hands moved over the controls, making adjustments, setting a course. "We do what we've always done. We fight." Kane's ship appeared on the radar, a dark shape closing in fast. The final battle had begun. As the enemy ship drew closer, Suri felt the rush of adrenaline in her veins. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for everything they had worked for. Freedom. The stars blurred as the two ships moved closer. The engines roared, and the space between them seemed to vanish in an instant. Daniel spun the ship hard to the left, avoiding the first round of gunfire. Suri was ready. Her fingers flew over the targeting system, locking onto Kane's ship. "Fire!" Daniel shouted. The blast hit Kane's ship, sending it tumbling off course. But Kane quickly regained control. firing back with deadly precision. The ship shook as the hit landed, but Daniel didn't flinch. He kept the ship steady, weaving in and out of Kane's shots. They were in the heart of the battle now, and there was no turning back. It was just them against Kane. Sari's mind focused. She had come too far to back down now. This wasn't just about her survival anymore. It was about freedom. One more shot. Sari, we finish this. Her hand gripped the controls. She locked onto the enemy's weak point, the engine, and fired. The shot hit. Kane's ship exploded in a burst of light, its engines flaring out of control. For a moment, there was silence. Then, Kane's voice came through the comms again, but this time it was different. You got me this time. The connection cut off. Daniel and Sari sat in the cockpit, breathing heavily. The silence of space returned, but it was a different kind of silence, one that marked their victory. Sari looked at Daniel, and for the first time, she saw the relief in his eyes. They had won. They had survived. Together. We did it, Sari whispered, a smile tugging at her lips. Daniel nodded, his face softening. Yeah, we did. They were free.